The image of the Viking generally settles in our minds as masters of the sea courageous warriors. However, the actual truth that history rarely voices begins when the clashes end. When the smoke from burning sanctuaries rose to the sky and the last sounds of prayer faded, the real horror revealed itself for the survivors. This was not for the warriors whose fate was sealed, but for the religious women who remained. These women, who had dedicated their lives to their faith, fell into a nightmare that would make death seem like a salvation. You will realize that your knowledge of Viking cruelty is incomplete. Even the most ancient sagas fall silent in the face of what happened next. If you value historical narratives proven by documents, join our channel. This helps us bring hidden truths to light. We also ask you to mention in the comments which city you are following us from. This episode is based on the notes of Ibn Fadlan and archaeological findings from Dublin's slave markets. Let's return to the year 845. The monastery at Clonmacnoise falls to the fleet under Thorgest's command. 43 monks lose their lives while protecting the altar. The chronicler of the era records this slaughter, but then lays down his pen. He never mentions the fate of the nuns. But archaeology breaks this silence. Excavations at Dublin's Wood Quay revealed the infrastructure of the Viking slave trade. Iron shackles adjusted for slender wrists, ankle rings no different from a child's, and the remains of storehouses designed to warehouse living people. The sole target of the Dublin Vikings was not gold or holy relics. They targeted the human body. A captured nun was no longer seen as a servant of God, but as a commercial good. Runic inscriptions found in Schleswig show price lists, carved in stone. 20 pieces of silver for a young nun, 15 for an older nun, 10 if she was wounded in the conflict. These receipts carved in stone are proof of the trade. But what the sagas do not tell is this. Being sold was nevertheless the best probability. In 862, Vikings razed the Portmaro monastery. Irish records write of the deaths of 47 warriors and fall silent. There is no mention of the women taken from the monastery. However, soil samples taken from nearby bogs whisper a different truth. 23 female bodies. All bore the same brutality. Blows to their skulls, struggle marks on their arms, and shattered ribs from prolonged assault. These did not happen in the heat of battle. These were ritualistic slaughters, systematic and repeated. Carbon dating shows the deaths occurred in the days immediately following the raid. These women were killed after they surrendered, while in captivity once their fates had been decided. The Vikings' decision was always the same. In 871, the great heathen army captured Reading. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles describe King Ethelred's defeat, but skip over what befell the holy women in the abbey. When the records fall silent, the earth speaks. In the area of the old Saxon palace, stains of iron oxide that is blood were found under the stones enough to belong to dozens of people. Viking war law had brutal rules. The wife of a defeated man or a nun under his protection became the property of her captor, not as a servant but as his woman. In Old Norse, this was known as Connor Anna acquired woman. That is a property expected to reproduce. The Gragas law compilations from Iceland detail this process. The captor declares his ownership in the presence of witnesses. The woman's will is disregarded. This act is legal. Even if conceived through violence, the children born are considered legitimate by law. Yet even this distorted marriage was not the worst end. In 878, Norse raiders attacked the Bangor monastery. The annals record the destruction, but not what followed. Archaeology fills the silence once more. Burnt layers revealed female bones arranged in ceremonial patterns. Viking burial traditions required human sacrifice. Women were killed as part of a warrior's send-off ritual. Ibn Fadlan himself witnessed such a ceremony on the Volga in 921. A slave girl was raped, drugged, and strangled before her master's funeral pyre. He saw it once, but archaeology proves it was repeated countless times. Analysis of Scandinavian boat graves reveals the same pattern. Female skeletons showing signs of strangulation, and in their teeth, traces of hallucinogenic plants like henbane used to suppress fear and ensure compliance. Perhaps what they saw in their final moments was a divine light. Perhaps it was something far darker. By the year 907, the Great Army was wintering at Thetford. The chronicles list stolen cattle and burned churches, but do not mention the abducted nuns. The waste heaps in the area, however, tell a different story. Among the refuse, dozens of infant bones were found, all bearing signs of intentional head trauma. These were not stillbirths. They were murder. They were children born from the rape of nuns by Vikings children whom neither faith nor father would accept. Their deaths were systematic and calculated. Viking law was clear. If the mother was property, the child was also property. If it could not serve, it would not live. Entire monastic settlements like Whitby, Iona, and Singham were erased from the records following Viking raids. Populations of holy women vanished overnight. At Repton, the Viking Great Army's camp from 873 to 874 excavations uncovered 249 skeletons. Only 63 were female. The numbers spoke the truth. The rest had been taken. Isotope analysis revealed the women buried here were not English. They were Christian nuns brought from Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, sold in overseas markets. The lucky ones died in childbirth. The others vanished into the slave routes, north to Scandinavia, east to the rivers of Rus, south to the markets of Islam. Dublin was not just a port, but a human processing centre. Each new dock expanded this trade. Behind the walls, the nuns of Christ lost everything, including their names. Their vows were eternal. The torment they endured was even longer. These places were not temporary detention centres. They were long-term human warehouses. 9th century Arab sources describe Viking slave caravans stretching from the Baltic to Baghdad. Nuns fetched the highest value in the eastern markets. Fair-skinned Celtic and Germanic nuns were treated as exotic treasures, an indicator of luxury and status among foreign buyers. The Vikings were aware of this demand and met it with brutal efficiency. They didn't just raid monasteries, they fed a global trade in sanctity and suffering. Their eastern routes passed through Novgorod and Kiev, a journey of thousands of kilometers down the Dnieper River. Ship manifests carved in runes listed human cargo alongside furs and amber. 20 nuns per vessel, a standard shipment. But the most dreadful end was neither slavery, nor forced conversion, nor ritual sacrifice. This end was reserved for those who chose to resist. In 914, Irish forces retook Dublin from the Norse. The Annals of the Four Masters records this liberation, but not the horror they encountered just outside the city walls. Excavations revealed stone-lined execution pits, designed not for death, but for killing through torture. Inside skeletons were found with signs of intentional trauma. Legs broken so they could not escape, arms shattered so they could not harm themselves. The nuns were kept alive while they perished. Each pit was approximately 1.8 meters deep and 1 meter wide. Too narrow to lie down, too shallow to stand. The victims died over days, sometimes weeks in a crouched position. Viking law codes describe similar punishments for slaves or captives who struck their master. Being buried alive but never quickly. The pit was dug shallow enough for air, deep enough to prevent escape. Death came slowly from thirst, starvation, or exposure. Soil samples from Dublin confirm prolonged decomposition periods, proving these women were left to die over time. The cruelty was calculated. Some pits were lined with sharp stones, others were filled with cold water. The purpose was not execution, but a spectacle, a performance of suffering staged for those still alive. Other captive nuns were forced to watch. The message was clear: either obedience or this torment. In 919, Norwegian King Harald Fairhair consolidated his power. Civil wars ceased, Viking expansion slowed, but the slave networks remained. Peace did not end this trade. On the contrary, it perfected it. The same routes once used for raids transformed into organized human trafficking systems. Records show Viking merchants offering guaranteed delivery of human cargo. Byzantine trade agreements even included these terms. The 944 Rus-Byzantine Treaty priced slaves by category. Young nuns were at a premium, pregnant ones were discounted, and children under 10 were almost worthless. This was not chaos. It was organized commerce. At the Battle of Brunanburh in 937, 5 Irish and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms united to crush the Norse. They won a decisive victory, but what they found in the Viking supply trains was incredible. Portable breeding pens, iron frames designed for living captives, chain assemblies, small enough for children, and mobile slave markets that moved with the army. These pens were modular compartments designed for long-term confinement, which could be dismantled and rebuilt in hours. Archaeologists found anchor rings worn smooth by the friction of chains, proof of constant use. The engineering was efficient, systematic, and horrific. The captured nuns were not accidental casualties of war. They were the prize itself. They were living resources to be collected, processed, and distributed. The Viking economy depended on their forced labor. Spiritual women were turned into the gears of an empire's economic machine. Archaeological surveys of Norse settlements from Dublin to Hedeby show a consistent pattern. Every major town had holding facilities, every port a processing station. The infrastructure of captivity was everywhere, hidden in plain sight. In 954, when Eric Bloodaxe died at Stainmore and the last Viking kingdom in England collapsed, this system did not disappear. It just changed hands. Christian kingdoms inherited the Viking slave networks and repurposed them for their own ends. Monastery records from the following century list large numbers of indentured servants. These were not volunteers. They were rebranded slaves. Nuns, once seized by Vikings, now served Christian masters. Only the words had changed. The chains remained the same. In 966, with Harold Hardrada's death at Stamford Bridge, the Viking Age in England officially ended. But the graves told a darker story. Mass graves filled with nuns, dated to the same period as the Viking defeats, pointed to a sinister situation. When Viking power collapsed, the evidence had to disappear too. The testimonies had to be silenced. At Repton excavations uncovered a mass grave sealed in 986, containing the remains of 236 individuals, all female. All bore the marks of an organized execution. Isotope analysis showed they were Norse, not English. These were not prisoners. They were Viking nuns living in Norse colonies, executed by their own people to prevent their capture as English forces advanced. The method was identical to the one they used on their own captives: blunt force trauma strangulation poisoning. Fathers killed their daughters, abbots executed their novices, husbands murdered their wives. They did this not in rage, but as a grim ritual. They knew exactly what awaited a captured nun because they had inflicted it themselves. Analysis of the debris and grave soil showed this was not a single massacre, but an orderly extermination spread over several days. Among the remains was a skull carved with a runic inscription: "Better svar far, better this way." Someone in the midst of the slaughter had taken the time to carve these words to justify the atrocity. The skull belonged to a young nun, 12 to 14 years old, born in Norway, brought to England as a child, and murdered by her own people to prevent her capture. Those words carved into her bone were not a sign of mercy, but a confession. This system of sexual violence was not random savagery. It was law. The Icelandic Gragas laws included procedures for claiming nuns as property. The captor had to publicly declare his right in front of witnesses. A nun's resistance had no standing. Her consent was not even a question. If she committed suicide to escape her captor, could demand compensation from her family. 40 silver marks the price of a life and a year's labor. In their law, suicide was seen as theft of property. In 978, Ethelred became King of England. One of his first decrees targeted the Viking slave trade, not to abolish it, but to tax it. Royal Customs records from London list the duties on human cargo. 5 silver pieces per nun, 2 per child. The English were not disgusted by the Viking brutality. They were envious of the profit it provided. Maritime archaeology confirms how advanced this trade became. Shipwrecks in the North Sea show specialized ventilation shafts for living cargo water stores, sufficient for weeks at sea, and reinforced holes to ensure stability under human weight. These were not raiding ships. They were ships designed for transport. One such vessel, dated to 912, could hold 80 people below deck. Burn marks suggest the ship caught fire at sea, and all cargo was lost. 80 nuns perished in chains, the ocean their grave. Yet some resisted in ways the chronicles refused to record. Faint traces remain in a scattered notes and skeletal evidence, broken shackles, crushed bones near riverbanks, fragments of rosary beads buried in mud. This is proof that some nuns fought back even knowing that resistance meant a slower death. Their defiance is the one thing even the sagas could not erase. A nun named Gunhild appears in the Frankish chronicles. She is described as a freed former Norse captive who turned her faith into a tool of vengeance. This woman who once wore chains now wore the cross like a weapon. Gunhild knew the Vikings' methods, their roots, and their fears. For 7 relentless years, she waged her own holy war against them. Frankish sources credit her with burning 12 Viking camps and freeing more than 300 nuns who had been abducted from monasteries along the coast. She fought them using their own tactics. Surprise raids, night attacks, no mercy, no prisoners. No. Her final assault targeted the great slave market. Contemporary accounts speak of divine retribution. All 47 Viking traders in the city were executed with the same method. First they were mutilated, then left to bleed to death. After that, Gunhild disappeared from the records. But the archaeological layers in burned Norse settlements along the Seine tell the rest of her story. Someone was hunting the Vikings. Someone who knew exactly where to strike and how to make them afraid. The practice of claiming defeated nuns spread beyond Scandinavia. By the 11th century, Norman sources were describing similar practices in newly conquered England. William's knights received land grants that included all chattels found thereon. These chattels included nuns listed alongside livestock and grain. The Domesday Book catalogued this without shame. Manor entries listed female dependents as property valued, just like agricultural tools. Archaeological studies of Norman castles reveal how this system worked. Beneath the courtyards, stone cells with iron doors and no windows were built specifically to hold nuns. Some could contain 30 people at a time. Bone fragments from these sites show an infant mortality rate near 100%. The children born within these walls rarely survived. This was not a case of neglect. It was a deliberate strategy. A child born of forced union was evidence, and evidence was dangerous. Mixed blood meant scandal, legal liability, and divine shame. Therefore, erasure became standard procedure. In 1066, Harold Godwinson fell at Hastings, and England itself became a conquered land. The Norman invasion copied the Viking tradition exactly. The systematic capture of Saxon nuns, forced marriages to Norman knights, and legal frameworks that redefined assault as holy union. Chroniclers of the time, blinded by victory, called this purification the civilizing of the Saxon bloodline. However, what history called civilization was, in fact, ethnic cleansing carried out through sexual violence. Dowries and inheritances turned faith into currency. A nun's body could legitimize land transfers. Consent was irrelevant. Church records are full of whispers of resistance. Some Saxon nuns chose martyrdom, taking their own lives rather than submitting. The number of women in convents tripled in the decade after Hastings. Abbeys filled with traumatized women seeking protection. Yet even holy walls could not erase despair. The suicide rate among noble nuns rose so sharply that the church began to call it sanctified sacrifice, a death for purity's sake. The state, however, called it destruction of property. Genetic research now reveals the truth that medieval scribes tried to cover up. Isotope studies of graveyards show patterns of population mixing that directly align with known Viking slave routes. Celtic and Saxon mitochondrial DNA female lineage appears in Scandinavian remains from the 9th century onward. This was not migration. It was reproduction through conquest. The Vikings created an empire of bloodlines. The genetics of modern Icelanders carry approximately 60% Celtic female lineage. The Norwegian population shows 40% from the British Isles. Each of these numbers represents hundreds of monasteries, stormed thousands of nuns taken, and tens of thousands of births forced by terror. Recent excavations in Jorvik, modern-day York, revealed something even darker. Beneath layers of medieval rubble, archaeologists found a structure mentioned in no text. 64 individual cells cut into stone. Carbon dating places its construction around 876 CE. Every cell had iron rings embedded in the walls, polished smooth from constant restraint. This was not a prison. It was a production facility. Soil analysis shows it was in continuous use for 40 years. The bone fragments tell a single story. Every occupant here was a nun. Every one of them endured multiple pregnancies, and all were discarded when they could no longer bear children. This building stood in the very heart of York. Everyone must have known. The records from the nearby cathedral list the baptisms of 732 children born in that facility. Over 4 decades, only 12 children lived past the age of 5. The records call them foundlings of unknown parentage. They were sold as servants to wealthy families. Their very existence was used to finance new chapels and cloisters. The work of God was financed by systematic violation. The financial ledgers of York Minster confirm regular payments to those who operated the building. These were not bribes, but official contracts for sanctuary services. The church was not a bystander in this situation. It was a partner. This model was repeated all across Viking-controlled Europe. Every major Norse settlement had its own version of these facilities. Every bishop kept baptismal records for the offspring. Every authority profited from it. The infrastructure was vast, the profits obscene, the suffering immeasurable. Yet even this industry of horror was not the end. The most shocking discovery comes once again from Repton. Beneath the known mass grave of executed Norse nuns, archaeologists found deeper layers. Multiple burial phases spanning 50 years. This was not a single massacre. It was an operation of elimination spanning generations. Chemical tests showed traces of mercury compounds in the bones. Deliberate poisoning. The toxin acted slowly, causing madness before death. The victims must have raved and screamed, their minds disintegrating long before their bodies failed. This was a calculated cruelty that silenced the nuns by making them appear insane. Under Viking law, the testimony of an insane woman held no validity. Madness eradicated the truth, so they were poisoned. Not merely to die, but so that they would not be believed. Even those who survived long enough to speak could no longer form coherent sentences. The suffering they endured became the very tool of their own erasure. The excavations also uncovered the remains of children mixed with the adult nuns. Mother and child executed together. Families were entirely eliminated to prevent their memories from being carried forward. Isotope analysis showed the victims were not random. They were chosen. Nuns who had served as translators, overseers, or witnesses. Those who knew too much to live. Knowledge was the final unforgivable crime. And then there was the inscription. A skull carved with 3 runic words. Better, far, far better this way. Someone in the midst of a mass execution had taken the time to justify the slaughter. The skull belonged to a nun barely in her teens. She had been born in Norway, brought to England as a child, and murdered by the very people who had once called her sacred. Those words carved into her bone were not a sign of mercy, but a confession. They knew exactly what awaited captured nuns because they had done it themselves. If you believe these forgotten voices deserve to be heard, subscribe to this channel. We here bring to light the stories that official history tried to silence.